So I want to talk about the word Lamanite. It's a term that comes from here, from the Book of Mormon. And I've been called a Lamanite. And that's because I'm Native American, I'm Navajo, I'm also a Latter-day Saint. And so this has interested me for a long time. But I've noticed that there's kind of different perspectives here because this word can be a debated term or controversial term. I see members kind of naively using this word or using it with some of the 19th century cultural baggage that has been attached to it. I also see critics making some good points, but maybe going too far and missing some important research that I've enjoyed the last decade and that I wish more people knew about. So in this video, I want to talk about the term Lamanite and what it means. So I was recently interviewed by the Salt Lake Tribune about the term Lamanite and gave my opinions of what I think it means. And I just wanted to make this video to kind of clarify my ideas about it. A lot of it is just based off good research out there. And I don't know when the article is going to come out, but this can be a supplementary, more expansive or deeper dive into it. So let's go over the kind of the context of what the term is. So it comes from the Book of Mormon. Again, the Book of Mormon begins with a family in Jerusalem, the family of Lehi. They flee Jerusalem through Arabia, and they come into the Promised Land, the Americas. And basically what happens is they split, and you get the Nephites and the Lamanites. And eventually, after 1,000 years or so, these two groups grow into these major civilizations, and they have wars and battles and fights between them throughout the entire span of their history. And eventually, the Lamanites destroy the Nephites. And for Latter-day Saints, they saw this story and they imagined that every Native American in the Americas were the descendants of this remaining group, the Lamanites. So you get early Latter-day Saints and Latter-day Saints today calling Native Americans the Lamanites. Now that kind of basic story brings up some pretty major problems. If every Native American is a Lamanite, then we should be able to find Hebrew DNA in them, which we haven't. Also, if every Native American is a Lamanite, then do we erase Native American history? Do all these different tribes and nations lose their history, and do we replace it with this book made by this white man, and now that's their history and their other histories don't matter? That can hurt a ton. And there's a lot of other problems that come up because of this kind of basic story idea. What I think people miss is what the Book of Mormon itself says about Lamanites. Instead of taking what Brigham Young thought Lamanites were, or even Joseph Smith, what does the Book of Mormon itself say that Lamanites are? And we get a really, really interesting verse or section in the Book of Mormon towards the beginning of what Lamanites are. And it's by the prophet Jacob. Jacob's the brother of Nephi. So one of the first peoples in the Book of Mormon, he explains what Lamanites or who Lamanites are. Jacob's explaining all these different groups. The Nephites, the Lamanites, he even goes into the Lemuelites, the Ishmaelites, the Zoramites. He goes into all these different groups from them. But then he says something really interesting that just changes everything about these terms. In Jacob 1:14, it says, "But I, Jacob, shall not hereafter distinguish them by these names." So he's saying instead of these names, we're going to do something else here. But I shall call them Lamanites that seek to destroy the people of Nephi. So now, anyone outside the Nephites who's trying to destroy them, they're all just Lamanites. All these different groups are Lamanites now. And those who are friendly to Nephi, I shall call Nephites, or the people of Nephi, according to the reigns of the kings. So now Nephites are just people who are friendly to the Nephites. Suddenly, these two terms, Nephites and Lamanites, are not lineage or ancestry or bloodline. Suddenly, they're groups, their identity. They're kind of these tribal ways of identifying other people, kind of a bit political as well. And we miss that. And I don't know why early Latter-day Saints missed that. Well, I have an idea of why they missed it. It's because they were living in a culture of deep-seated racism. And we'll go more into that later. But if you look at just what the text says, it's saying that if you're for Nephites, if you're part of their group, if you're supportive of them, then you're Nephites. If you're against them, then you're Lamanites. A really, really generic term here. It's almost like Lamanites are the Gentiles, this other group, if we want to relate it to biblical language here. But it's not just that verse. There's lots of verses in the Book of Mormon that redefine who Lamanites are. So, for example, in Alma 3:10-11, this is kind of the same idea. Therefore, whosoever suffered himself to be led away by the Lamanites was called under that head. So if even someone from the Nephites joined the Lamanites and were led away from them, they were called Lamanites. And it came to pass that whosoever would not believe in the tradition of the Lamanites were called the Nephites, or the people of Nephi, from that time forth. So now if you believed what they believed, you're suddenly called the Nephites. It doesn't have to do with blood or ancestry here, or lineage. 2 Nephi 5:9 is a small example. And all those who were with me did take upon them to call themselves the people of Nephi. So if you were with Nephi, you became a Nephite. There's more. There's more than that. So there's actually a lot of verses that talk about groups of people who don't want to be numbered with their ancestors because their ancestors did something bad. They want to be numbered with the Nephites, showing how it's not about lineage here. And there's actually some pretty cool verses about this. So this next verse in Mosiah 25 is probably one of my most favorite examples of this. Mosiah 25:12-13. And it came to pass that those who were the children of Amulon was this bad guy, and these were his descendants, they would no longer be called by the names of their fathers. Therefore they took upon themselves the name of Nephi. They took Nephi upon themselves, that they might be called the children of Nephi. So now they're suddenly the children of Nephi, not literally the children, but they're calling themselves the children of Nephi, and be numbered among those who are called Nephites. And that's the people of Amulon. In the next verse, it talks about the people of Zarahemla. And now all the people of Zarahemla were numbered with the Nephites. So now you get different groups being numbered with the Nephites or numbered with the Lamanites. It's not a ancestral DNA genetic term here. It's really loose. It's pretty interesting. And the Book of Mormon is full of this. Another good example is towards the middle of the Book of Mormon, the main part of the Book of Mormon, when Jesus comes to the people after he teaches them and then leaves. The Nephites are going through this time of unity and prosperity, but there slowly starts to be divisions. And in 4th Nephi 1 verse 20, it says, there was still peace in the land, save it were a small part of the people who had revolted from the church and taken upon them the name of Lamanites. So they're just taking this name upon them. Therefore, there began to be Lamanites again in the land. So suddenly there's Lamanites. Suddenly there's this other group. Suddenly there's these Gentiles, maybe. And later in 4th Nephi chapter 20, it digs even more into this. It says, and it came to pass that in this year there arose a people who were called the Nephites, and they were true believers in Christ. So again, if you're part of this covenant group, you are the Nephites, kind of like the Jews in the way. And if you're outside that group, you're the Gentiles, if we're using biblical terms here. Now, what we're seeing here is kind of like an us versus them mentality, a way of othering the other group, a way to distinguish yourself from the other group, the covenant people to the outside group. And I'm not saying it's only political, because there is some lineage to it. I mean, it does say people are kind of proud of their heritage of being a direct descendant of Nephi or something. But the fact that they have to point out that they're a direct descendant of Nephi or Laman kind of shows that there were other people around them, and this was more than just a lineage term. So, really interesting way to think about Nephites and Lamanites here. And this is just kind of like the tip of the iceberg of the scriptural evidence here. There's so much more that it just can't be ignored. And so you have critics who might ignore this in their criticisms of the church or of the term Lamanites. You have members who don't even realize this type of stuff. And I think it comes to life more. I think it brings the term Lamanite more to life. It makes it feel more like a covenant term. And a lot of people who identify themselves as Lamanites can still grasp and lay hold on those covenants to Lamanites, the promises, the blessings, the prophecies. That's even stronger when you think about it this way. Now, another vital thing that I think people miss is the idea that there were other people around the Nephites and Lamanites. We know that just from archaeology. There were hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of native peoples around these Book of Mormon peoples. It would have just had to have been that way. Now, the awesome thing is that the Book of Mormon shows this. There's tons of references within the Book of Mormon of them indirectly talking about other people. And I did a whole video about that on my channel. So go check that one out if you want to get really into the details. And there's been a ton of research about this, and it brings the Book of Mormon to life. And I'm just surprised how many members aren't aware of this. But just as a basic summary of how we see other peoples in the Book of Mormon, we got things like after the people of Nephi separate from the Lamanites, they start building buildings, they start building temples, they start having wars. And you got to realize that this was originally a group of about 40 to 50 people who came into the Americas. Then they split in about 2020. They probably had children and other stuff. To build cities and wars and stuff, that's impossible unless they had other people. All of a sudden, the Nephites are worried about things like polygamy, and that would be kind of impossible with a group of just like a few dozen people. It makes sense if there were already indigenous people around them, and the Nephites were kind of grappling with the culture of these indigenous peoples and how to deal with it with their own faith. It's just kind of interesting how a lot of these things happen during Jacob's time. He changes the term. There's a man named Sherem who has to go find Jacob, and the text specifically says that Sherem had to learn his language and then seek out Jacob, which wouldn't make sense if they were this small group. You just could go next door and knock on Jacob's house and say, "Hey, I want to debate you." But no, it makes a big case that Sherem had to seek him out and that he was learning their language. So that makes sense if there's this wider group around them. The other thing about Jacob that I find interesting is you can see that when he's sharing the chapters of Isaiah, when he's sharing the book of Isaiah to his people, it talks a lot about the Gentiles around the house of Israel, how the Gentiles will take care of them and how they'll live in a land of strangers. When you share scriptures with people, usually it hits home better when you can apply those scriptures to yourself. So you can see Jacob using Isaiah to grapple with all these indigenous peoples around them. And for some reason, this is something that early church leaders and church members missed. You could kind of understand why when you think of how science wasn't really a thing back then. Archaeology wasn't an established field back then. I mean, people used the Bible to figure out how old the earth was and things like that. Also, the early saints were being persecuted. They were literally driven from city to city to city to a different country. And so to sit down and really study the Book of Mormon, they didn't have that time on their hands. Also, they lived in a culture of deep racism. And I don't think we fully realize this as Latter-day Saints. So the Book of Mormon was published in 1830. Shortly after is when Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which forced Native Americans, I think it was to the other side of the Mississippi River, something like that. And that's where you get stories like the Trail of Tears and things like that. Major things happening with Native Americans. You also got a heavy culture on slavery and blacks and African Americans and people with African descent. And it's a very racist culture that the saints are in. But all of this is to just show how the early saints pretty much misinterpreted the Book of Mormon. It's not the Book of Mormon itself. And from that is where you start seeing the idea where early Latter-day Saints thought the Book of Mormon happened all over the Americas, and it included every Native American as Lamanites. It wasn't until later when they sat down and started using the right tools and time that they really started figuring out that the Book of Mormon, the text of the Book of Mormon itself, says it happened in a smaller spot. This isn't something apologists made up to answer hard questions. When you look at just the text, it says that they're this smaller group. They couldn't have been that huge because the distances between certain cities are just a few days. It's impossible to go from Panama all the way up to Hill Cumorah in some of these time lengths that it provides. So it was a smaller area. And that idea with others and with other people around them, and this being a smaller area, solves so many problems. It solves a lot of the DNA issue, because if they were a smaller group among hundreds of thousands, if not millions of natives, their DNA would have been lost. It answers archaeology. If they were a smaller group over thousands of years, their archaeology would have been built over. But it helps answer an important question for Lamanites and Native Americans. And that's kind of the idea of colonization here. Does the Book of Mormon erase Native American identity, Native American history, Native American culture and stories? If you think about it with this other perspective, that there were other people around them and the Nephites were a smaller group, now every Native American group and tribe can keep their own stories and their own culture and history, and the Book of Mormon can keep its, because it's this different group. Its promises and stuff, I think, can be extended to every Indigenous person, and that's where you get this Lamanite covenant that if Indigenous peoples want to take advantage of, it's pretty powerful. When you read the Book of Mormon, I think there's a lot in the Book of Mormon that is actually condemning of colonization. You see it when Nephi is sorrowful about what's going to happen to his people and condemns what happened and what happens to them, and so does the Lord. And then you get these promises that happened to Nephi's smaller group, but it can be, these blessings and stuff can be applied to every Native American group if they want it. But how can other Indigenous people take advantage of the promises from the Book of Mormon? Well, the Book of Mormon answers this. It has an interesting concept in it about adoption, where you can be adopted into Lehi's seed. And we saw that with people being numbered with Nephi. Well, the Book of Mormon right here in 1 Nephi 14, 2-3, talks about the promises of Lehi being extended to the Gentiles. And remember, Lamanites are like Gentiles. It's this more biblical term. So that verse says, "And it shall come to pass that if the Gentiles shall hearken unto the Lamb of God, and harden not their hearts against the Lamb of God, they shall be numbered among the seed of thy father." That's really interesting because it specifically says seed of thy father, the seed of Lehi, and you could be adopted into the seed of Lehi. So it's not about genetics here. It's this really awesome concept of being adopted. And the Book of Mormon is full of this. We talked about that, how people wanted to be numbered with the Nephites. And that way you can take upon yourself all these blessings and promises and prophecies and covenants to Lehi's seed. So this idea of adoption helps answer what it means to be a Lamanites. It doesn't have to be genetic. The seed of Lehi is not literal ancestry lineage. And this is what the Book of Mormon says. And I think sometimes critics miss that. Like they're taking it more literal than the text does. I think members have missed this. I think early Latter-day Saints have missed this. Being a Lamanite is not about genetics, not always. It helps answer the DNA question. I mean, why can't we find Hebrew DNA in Native Americans today? Well, first off, the Book of Mormon says it's not about genetics, so that's kind of the wrong question or to ask, or the wrong point to make. But there is a genetic angle that's important to point out, and that's the idea of we all have a common ancestor. That's kind of a scientific fact. You go back enough in time, we'll all find a common ancestor between us. If you've ever opened up your ancestry app with someone else, you'll find some type of relative back several generations or something like that. That's just a scientific fact. So it could be that, Lehi landed in the Americas and his nephew eventually traveled far north to from Mesoamerica to North America, and then eventually mixed with the people there. I could have a link to him that's undetectable by DNA studies. I mean, DNA studies aren't perfect. They could only go so far back, depending on the type of DNA method you use. But there's examples in Iceland of people having genealogical records that go back really far, and the DNA evidence can only go back so far and not prove it. So maybe someday DNA studies will get that advanced. Who knows? We'll see. But the idea that we all have a common ancestor and that somehow Lehi's undetectable genetics could have spread throughout the Americas is plausible just based on DNA studies. It's just not detectable today. But that said, I do think the idea of adoption and this term this idea of the Lamanite term meaning Gentile makes more sense for me. Now, throughout this video, I've brought up the idea of just going straight to the text instead of other people's opinions, and I think that's vital here. Now, a good example of this is the introduction to the Book of Mormon. The introduction to the Book of Mormon used to say, after thousands of years, all were destroyed except the Lamanites, and they are the principal ancestors of the American Indians. So it used to say principal. These Lamanites were the main, only ancestors of Native Americans. Later, that was changed to say, after thousands of years, all were destroyed except the Lamanites, and they are among the ancestors of the American Indians. Among the ancestors. So not the principal, but they are some of them. And when that came out, people who were more critical of the church were starting to claim that the church is changing their position because DNA wasn't supporting them. However, there's a lot of things to keep in mind with this. The idea with going straight to the text is the main thing for me. The introduction was never part of the original Book of Mormon. It was made sometime, I don't know, in the 1980s or something like that, is when they put this introduction together and they put it in the Book of Mormon to define who the Lamanites were. It was never part of the text, though. And from what I've heard from scholars like Dan Peterson, there was actually a bit of controversy among the committee that put together this introduction, and some people disagreed. From what I've also read is that the idea of among the ancestors of American Indians was actually an idea that a quote that came from, I think, the 1940s or something. So I want to do a video just about this topic in general, but you can see here that this was never in the original text. This was people's opinions. So while I do agree that the church was changing its position here, whether from people giving criticisms about that statement or from better research and tools, the main thing is it doesn't really show that the Book of Mormon itself is wrong, because the Book of Mormon never made that claim. So we always need to remember to go straight to the text. And I do think people who are critical of the church make some really good points. That's why I enjoy reading a lot of their stuff. I mean, for example, the Book of Mormon has pictures to illustrate it of white people, huge muscles, European looking, even Viking type armor, which is not accurate and which is actually kind of harmful as well. But those images were never part of the original text, and that's probably something we should fix. I think there's a lot of things that we could fix. At the same time, does it hurt the text of the Book of Mormon? Well, we need to go to the text and see what it says itself. And I mean, I take this a bit further. Even the chapter headings are not part of the original Book of Mormon. Even the verses are not part of the original Book of Mormon. It read like a book. And sometimes these chapter headings would split sections that shouldn't have even been split. And when you put them back together, you can start to see a clear picture, and even some really neat evidences come out that I'll talk to you guys later, like the idea of Tumbaga in the Book of Mormon. But go as close as you can to the text when you're trying to study these things out. And you can see that when you do that, terms like the Lamanites start to mean something different than we've assumed over time. Now, I hope you can see that my purpose here is not to just go after people who are critical of the church or question the church or who have honest concerns. I also want to help members get out of some of these kind of harmful past 19th century racial, cultural baggage that we've brought onto the text. And there's a lot of things in our church that I think we can fix. And there's a lot of things we need to address where early Latter-day Saints brought this deep racial culture onto the text and reinterpreted it, just like Christians in the past have misused the Bible. Latter-day Saints shouldn't think that they are immune from that. We've done the same in sometimes very harmful ways that have led to potential wars and massacres that I think we need to address, and that I hope to really start building more information about on this channel, and to kind of help with the movement of bringing more of these things to people's awareness. And I think we're kind of doing that. The church is publishing more stuff about Native Americans. If you haven't seen the new project they just put out about the Northwestern Shoshone tribe and their interactions with the church and membership of the church, and releasing all these documents, I think more stuff like that needs to happen. I think there needs to be gospel topic essays on Indigenous peoples and the church, real gospel topic essays, more essays about some of these massacres and wars that have happened. A lot of that needs to happen. But as I hope I've been saying here, that I don't really think that affects the core truths of our faith, the Book of Mormon, and the church. And I actually think as we weed some of this stuff out, the gospel shines brighter and our faith becomes stronger. And we learn how to more maturely use the Book of Mormon and develop our faith. You know, a big reason I started studying the term Lamanite was actually because I saw members misusing it way too much in order to support their geography model. And they would kind of cherry pick statements from Joseph Smith or Brigham Young in North America to support their theory, forgetting or neglecting or ignoring all the other statements about Lamanites throughout the entire Americas. Not realizing or not understanding the idea that Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and everyone thought the Book of Mormon happened all over the place, and therefore Lamanites were all over the place. And a lot of times in some of these groups, they promote these ideas for more of a political agenda. Their model has become more politicized and more extreme. And sometimes they could use these terms in harmful ways that will erase the history of North American tribes. Along those lines, on the critical side, I think some critics will assume or suggest that these extreme Latter-day Saints represent every Latter-day Saint. And that's not the case. And so, I mean, you got to look at what the text says, first of all, and then what Latter-day Saint academics and scholars in the church are saying about this term. And you'll find essays about Lamanites today that are saying the same thing I am. I'm just going more in depth into it. And so kind of along all of this, I don't like being called a Lamanite. I think it's a quick label that we give to other people, and it has this cultural baggage on it that unfortunately, we can't really change right now. That doesn't mean I think that we should abandon the term. I think we should treat it like the term Gentile. And I don't go around calling all of my white friends Gentiles, right? I think we should use it more that way. But I do want to say that there are a lot of Native Americans, especially in Central America and South America, who have embraced the term Lamanite. And I could kind of understand that because that's a very different culture than us up here in North America. And so I don't want to take away that from them. A lot of Native Latter-day Saints have embraced that term. I'm actually being more technical here in how I am defining Lamanites based off all of this research. But I think that what I'm proposing here is that it actually makes the term Lamanite stronger, because now we're focusing on the covenantal Lamanite rather than the genetic Lamanite. And we're focusing on the promises and blessings and everything the Lord has prophesied that'll make things right for Indigenous peoples. And now we can focus on that. And so I just want to make sure I say that, because I don't want to take away from what other Indigenous peoples have gotten from the term and from the Book of Mormon. Now, to end this video, we've got to mention the most important thing here about the term Lamanites and the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon is very anti-discriminatory. It's very anti-racist in a way. Even though racism was different back then, it's very anti-othering a different group, tribalism. And you see it in the Book of Mormon. It literally says in 4 Nephi 1:17, after Christ came and everyone embraced his gospel, that there were no more robbers, no more murderers, neither were there Lamanites, nor any manner of ites, but they were all one, children of Christ. And here again, you see the Book of Mormon using children of Christ, becoming someone's child, even though you're not directly a descendant of him. Children of Christ and heirs to the kingdom of God. And that's one of the main messages of the Book of Mormon. And for some reason, we've missed this. Members, maybe because of this cultural baggage that we read the Book of Mormon through. People with concerns or criticisms or questions because of the critical lens that we read it through. The Book of Mormon is actually very anti-discriminatory, and that's one video of many I want to do. I want to do videos about DNA in the Book of Mormon. I want to do videos about the Indian placement program, which my mom was a part of, which I'm basically a product of. So many videos that we need to do. And so I hope you guys will hit subscribe and that you'll share this video so that we can start making changes in the LDS community together. And for now, if you're interested, check out this video here about how we may have misinterpreted the black skin in the Book of Mormon. Thanks.